Good morning, scholars, and happy Monday. I am Ms. Canetta from Stanford Charter School for Excellence, and I'm excited to be back with you all today for our reading lesson. Today we are going to start by learning about quotations. Quotation marks are used to show the exact words a person says. Just like the first letter of any sentence, the first letter of a quotation is always capitalized. There will always be a punctuation mark at the end of the quotation, and it goes inside of the quotation mark. We use commas to separate the words a person is saying, or the quote, from the words that tell who is speaking. We can learn a lot about what is happening in a story, how the characters are feeling, and so much more just from the dialogue and quotations. Let's look at this first example. Mario said, "We got library cards." This is a statement or declarative sentence, which we learned about in the last lesson, so there is a period at the end. This quotation starts by telling us who is speaking, Mario. Notice how there are not quotation marks around Mario said. Also notice there is a comma separating Mario said, or the words telling the reader who is speaking, from what is being said. The quotation, or the exact words a person says, always starts with a capital letter inside the first quotation mark. We see that in the sentence with the capital W in the word we. The quotation ends with a period and then the closing quotation marks. This sentence is an example of when the quotation marks come at the end of a sentence. Let's look at another way to say the exact same sentence, but now the quotation comes first. It starts with the opening quotation marks to signal to the reader that a character is speaking. The W for we is still capitalized inside the quotation mark. A big, important difference comes at the end of the quotation. Instead of a period, we use a comma to separate the dialogue from the rest of the sentence. The comma must go inside the ending quotation mark. Then the sentence is finished with the author telling us who said those exact words. Mark said, and then finally finished with a period. As we read dialogue and quotations, it is important to think to yourself, what words tell me that someone is speaking? What are the exact words that person is saying? We can learn a lot from the author's choice of words. Did they use said, yelled, exclaimed, whispered, asked, wondered? There are many clues and ways to add details by using quotations. Let's look at more examples. When we are reading stories or plays, what the characters say to each other is called dialogue. Direct speech is the exact words a person says. A quotation is when you use the exact words taken from a text. If you're using a detail from the text to support your answer and want to use the exact words, that is a quotation and must be shown using quotation marks and correct punctuation. We know that quotation marks are the punctuation used to show dialogue or quotations. They signal to a reader that someone is speaking. A split quotation is when direct speech is interrupted in the middle by the words that tell who is speaking. For example, "I scored," he exclaimed. "My team finally won." I have dialogue on both sides of where I tell who is speaking. "I scored" is dialogue, and then in the middle I said "he exclaimed" to tell the reader who's speaking, and then he continues by saying, "My team finally won." So it's split. In this first sentence, the dialogue comes at the end of the sentence. The first part, "the teacher said," tells us who is speaking. Notice how there are no quotation marks yet. Then the comma separates the tag, or who's speaking, from the dialogue. There is the beginning quotation marks and then a capital letter to start the dialogue. The end of the sentence is marked with a period and then a closing quotation mark. In the second sentence, "Some kids live very far away," said Anna. The dialogue comes first and then the who said the sentence comes at the end. So in this sentence, we start with the quotation marks and still start with a capital letter to start the sentence. At the end of the dialogue, there is not a period. We use a comma inside of the quotation mark, and then the rest of the sentence, "said Anna," period. Let's look at a few more examples, and there are 3 ways that we can use quotation marks. We just saw an example of when the quotation comes at the beginning. We start with the quotation marks, we start with a capital letter, and then we use a comma to separate the dialogue from the he said or she said, or whatever way the author chooses to let us know who is speaking. We've also seen examples of when dialogue is used at the end of a sentence. So the who is speaking, the he said in this case, is first. So he said, comma, and then the quotation marks. The first letter inside of the quotation marks is always going to be a capital letter, just like you are starting a new sentence. And just like a sentence, it needs to end with a quotation mark. Inside of that quotation mark, it is going to have the punctuation that matches the tag or the way the author chose to tell us who is speaking. If it says he asked, well, a question has a question mark. So instead of a period, you use a question mark. If it said he exclaimed or he yelled or he said excitedly, we might want to think about using an exclamation point to, again, tell the reader the tone or the mood of our characters. We spoke before of a split dialogue where we can have quotations or dialogue on both sides, and then the who is speaking goes in the middle. Again, notice how there are commas separating both times the dialogue from the he said, and then there's another comma to indicate that there's dialogue again. Let's look at one more example, and as we look at this example, I want you to think to yourself, which part of the sentence is the who is speaking, and which part of the sentence is what did they say? That's a lot of books, Greg told her. So I've marked and indicated that there are 2 different parts of the sentence. There is the dialogue, and then there is the way that the author is telling us who is speaking. If we look, this is an example of dialogue at the beginning of a sentence. That's a lot of books is what Greg is saying. So we start with our opening quotation mark to indicate someone is speaking. And then before we close the quotation marks, we have a comma to separate the 2 parts of our sentence. And then finally, we have Greg told her and a period to end our sentence. This is the end of our lesson together today. You're going to continue working on vocabulary and your second reading of My Librarian is a Camel with Your Teacher, and I will see you again tomorrow.